the pressure strategy on the Russians in terms of either sanctions, a weapon supply to Ukraine, or oil price doesn't seem to be there at the moment. So I think one of the things that one would be looking for, if this is a sort of kabuki dance, is the moment that Trump either condemns or says something negative about Putin.
Let's come on to the war in Ukraine specifically. Talks between US and Russian officials took place in Saudi Arabia yesterday. The Kremlin says the contents of the talk will not be published, with the results still being analysed by both sides. We had expected a joint statement as to what was discussed this morning, had nothing so far. Is Russia deliberately stringing along the Americans here?
Probably. This is, again, one of the things I learned in America, which you don't often hear in the UK, is this notion of a kabuki dance. And it was a phrase that Jim Mattis used to use a lot, which is a symbolic rather than a sort of substantial negotiations. And a kabuki dance is a stylized Japanese dancing. It's political grandstanding theatre. Now, Russia will want to try and not to be seen as the bad guy in this, and will try and give a little bit of an inch, but they won't give much more than an inch. This is for show for an audience, in my view, at the moment, nothing substantive. And again, we shouldn't necessarily think of this in a linear fashion. So I think, for example, I think the first thing you have to do is go back to the 8th of December. That was the date that Trump was in at Notre Dame, and the day that Assad fell. And on that day, he sort of said, let's have an immediate ceasefire and negotiations. We're now near the end of March. We haven't got an immediate ceasefire, and we're talking about various contours of temporary ceasefires around the edges of this. So, and in a way, that also shows the complexity of it. So, for example, if you take the two things that they've really been discussing, the cessation of attacks on civilian infrastructure, then again, what is civilian infrastructure? So, you would argue from a Ukrainian perspective that it's easy to say that it would be things like attacks on substations and those things which give light and substance to 100,000 people in a city. Ukraine, on the other hand, would say that attacking an oil refinery, which you could argue is a energy infrastructure, is actually stripping away the sinews of war which power the Russian war machine, because it's the money that comes from that which allows them to continue the war. So all those things show you the complexity, both in what is in terms of the targets, and secondly, potentially the weapons that you should use against it. Now, one of the things, again, here that we look at is sort of game theory. Game theory in international relations looks at these strategic interactions to understand the dynamics of negotiation, deterrence, and cooperation. And all of this is a sort of bargaining matrix. But at the moment, the thing looks sort of slightly skewed towards the Russians, because we did think that there would be some sort of pressure strategy on the Russians, whereas up to this point, we've just had a pressure strategy on the Ukrainians in terms of, the cessation of intelligence, weapons and satellite feeds, which seem to come online again somewhere around, I think, the 11th of March. Whereas the pressure strategy on the Russians in terms of either sanctions, a weapon supply to Ukraine, or oil price doesn't seem to be there at the moment. So I think one of the things that one would be looking for, if this is a sort of kabuki dance, is the moment that Trump either condemns or says something negative about Putin, which at the moment he's not done so. The other thing about game theory, which is sort of skewed at the moment, is the incredible comments at the weekend from Witkoff, who's supposed to be the special representative, which really were just in his conversation with Tucker Carlson, which really were just parroting Russia propaganda lines. It was absolutely incredible. And the one thing about that is that if your actions or rhetoric are perceived as inconsistent or self-serving, it undermines your leverage or your position as a mediator. And that's why I can see the Ukrainians being really upset about what Witkoff said and wanting him removed as a mediator, because he doesn't look like a mediator. He looks like a Russian foil. Now, again, that could play into something which is the other part of the kabuki dance, which is that there may already be an outcome which is predetermined between Russia and Ukraine. And that might be that for geopolitical rapprochement between Russia and Ukraine, that the US are prepared to sacrifice Ukraine. Now, of course, the problem with that is it doesn't give any agency to all the other people who have, who have a part to play in this. And that's why I think the European meeting this week is also really, really important in where we go in the future for this.
I mean, it's such a good point you raised, Chip, about Steve Witkoff and that remarkable interview he did with Tucker Carlson over the weekend. At one point saying he doesn't think that Vladimir Putin is a bad guy, that he respects Vladimir Putin. I mean, the mind boggles. But I suppose it raises the question, which is something we've touched on in the past on Frontline in recent weeks, which is, why does Ukraine need to engage with the US as the mediator here? If the US has essentially switched sides, or certainly is swallowing a lot of the Kremlin propaganda, then why should Ukraine engage in good faith with the Americans as the mediator? Why don't they say, no, we'd rather someone else. We want a European mediator. We want the Turks to mediate, say.
Well, all those could be within that. But again, to sever your relationship with the US would be, something which would not be wise. Because it's in their interest for a number of reasons. So firstly, I think if you look at this in military methodology and how you'd approach this in military orders, the intent from Trump is absolutely sound and is a good thing in human security terms. That intent is the war must end. The scheme of maneuver in military terms, we would look there at the how, the what, the where, the who, the when. That's when you get into the real difficulties of the complexity of trying to end war. Now, again, the third part of this in military terms is what is the main effort? And the main effort for Trump is a ceasefire and then negotiations. Now, at the moment, we're around the edges of this, not only in terms of that civilian infrastructure, but the second thing which they're talking about is, of course, the grain deal or the grain contours for the future. Now, Ukraine won the Battle of the Black Sea. So again, that is a peripheral issue in lots of ways. It is not a substantive issue. And therefore, then ultimately, you would go back to looking at this in the three ways that I've outlined previously. The first one, that Trump does see this through a humanitarian prism. The war must end, stop the killing. That is a very honourable thing to say, as I've said many times before, but potentially rewards the aggressor. The middle position, which I've outlined before, is come to the table or Ukraine, or we'll cease support, what we saw prior to the 11th of March. But at the same time, potentially saying to Russia, come to the table, oh Russia, or we'll support Ukraine with everything. Now, we don't know what the table looks like at the moment, because it seemed almost that someone had cut the table in half and arranged the Russian half of the table alongside the American half of the table. But if we see ultimately that Russia are not engaging in good faith, then you go to the right of arc, which I've outlined before, the Joe Wilson line from the Helsinki Commission on American-Russia Relations from last September, which is that ultimately Trump will see that Putin is a disingenuous negotiator, that nothing that he says will be substantive and no peace will hold for the long term. That is still the spectrum that we're looking at. You can't say that there are any certainties in this for the future. And, conflict termination leading to conflict resolution and some sort of peace settlement is a very complex business. This is also one of the reasons why Trump's rush to set a date, either 1 day, 100 days, by the 20th of April, is problematic. I mean, it took, for example, 2 years and 500 meetings to get to an armistice in the Korean War, and it took 5 years to get to the Paris Peace Accords for the ending of the Vietnam War, which then ultimately led to the South being taken over by the North because it wasn't sustainable and endurable, which are some of the words that the Trump administration have used. So what that really illustrates is that all of this is essentially a long and complex process. There are multiple parties, and there are likely to be several rounds before anything substantive can happen. And the other thing in terms of the military reality of this is advancing armies rarely stop fighting when their opponents become weaker. And Putin still perceives that Ukraine is the weaker party. And we mustn't forget that people go to war not for the sake of fighting, but for political objectives. He still has various minimalist and maximalist objectives. The minimalist one is to subsume all those provinces or all the oblasts or provinces which Witkoff almost seemed to give to him in the way that he talked to Tucker Carlson. And more worryingly, in what Lavrov said in the last couple of days about Ukraine is different. It is a breeding ground for Nazis, prepared for yet another attempt to rally all of Europe under racist and Nazi banners for a war against the Russian Federation. We will not overlook this task of denazifying the Ukrainian state. That would bring you back to his 21st of July 2021 essay about Ukrainians and Russian are the same people, and that he seeks to destroy the sovereignty of Ukraine.
I absolutely take your point, Chip, that it is still feasible that the Americans may lose patience with Vladimir Putin. They may think he's dragging his feet, that Russia isn't serious about peace talks, and that he's a disingenuous negotiator. But a lot of people would say, well, isn't that obvious already? So if they're not seeing it now, why would they see it in a month or two's time?
Well, again, this might be this notion that there are greater geopolitical rapprochement reasons about potentially trying to sever Russia from China on the assumption that China is the long-term enemy or competitor of the US, and that's where their future lies. Now, again, within a European context, you could say that we should have known this for a number of years. When under Obama they talked about the Asia pivot, it never really happened because of events in the Middle East with the rise of ISIS and all that came from that. It might be that this is one of the four-dimensional chess things to get Europe to stand up to the plate and to have its own pillar while they can concentrate their forces and their combat power in an Asian theatre. I just don't think that the way they're doing this would lead you to conclude that is the way that America are looking at it. And I don't think you could conclude by the background of a lot of the people and what they say within the inner circle of Trump that they're probably clever enough to think like that. And neither do a lot of them take expert advice. Their ability to take significant briefs, I don't think, is really there in their understanding of international relations and how they work.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.